once again, Christian greetings to all our valued listeners and viewers throughout the whole world, more particularly to all Shepherd's Rod believers, and most especially to our beloved brothers and sisters in the United States of America. Special greetings to our brethren in Colorado, in PG Island, Mexico, Spain, Africa, in the United Kingdom, and also to our brethren in Australia, and to all the 144,000 living saints scattered throughout the whole world. This program and this message is especially dedicated to the 144,000 living saints. May the good Lord bless you and have a wonderful evening. This is our episode number 7 on the subject, the Bible calendar. And to repeat again, it is the final restoration of the messages that had been trodden underfoot by the exceeding right horn. And according to Prophets and Kings 678, in the time of the end, all the divine institution must be restored. And the divinely appointed time, according to 1 TG 28 on page 15, it says, the judgment for the living, the day in which all things are to be restored. Mark chapter 9, verse 12. So it is in the period of the judgment for the living by which all things must be restored. The restoration is process, and it even commenced in the days of Martin Luther, according to 1SR Pocket Edition on page 81. Saying it is widely understood that during the period from the canonizing of the New Testament scriptures to the call of Martin Luther, the truth was cast to the ground, Daniel 8 verse 12, and that it then began to be lifted, first by the Lutherans preaching the doctrine of faith, the beginning of Reformation. So in this reading, 1SR Pocket Edition can easily discern that the truth that had been cast to the ground, trodden underfoot by the exceeding great horn, must be restored. And such restoration is in process, commencing in the days of Martin Luther. But the climactic point of such restoration, by which all things must be restored, according to our reading in 1 TG 28, page 15, is in the period of the judgment for the living. And we know that according to the General Conference Special on pages 19 and page 20, in doing all this, he sets in motion the power that is to restore all things. Hence Christ's positive declaration, Elijah truly shall first come and restore all things, Matthew 17 verse 11. Inevitably then, without his message, we would die in our ignorance and in our sins, never live to see the restoration completed. So the statement, the restoration completed, it is divinely appointed that at the time when God sent antitypical Elijah the Tishbite, the promised prophet, that is the time when all things are restored. And the prominent one of such restoration must be the Bible calendar. Because without the Bible calendar, there is no possibility that we could locate all the time prophecy. Because Bible time prophecy must be reckoned with the Bible reckoning. Here in track number 6, page 20 and page 21, for example, this prophetic event concerning the 1,260 days, it says here, these olive trees are called witnesses, anointed ones, prophets. They were to prophesy in sackcloth for the space of 42 months. This is a period equivalent to that in Daniel 7 verse 25 and Revelation 12 verse 14. That is to a time and times and dividing of time. A time 1 year, times 2 years, half a time, half a year. 42 months in total. It is equivalent also to that in Revelation 13 verse 5, 40 and 2 months. And to that in Revelation 12 verse 6, 1,203 score days. In each instance, the time reckoning by the biblical rule of 30 days to a month amounts to 1,260 days. So it says, reckoning by the biblical rule, by which there must be 30 days each month and 12 months in a year. which is equivalent to 360 days in 1 year. Now, one of the reason, according to 1SR, page 116, saying, however, we cannot point out the exact day or month or even the year because, number one, we do not know the exact day of the call of Luther. Second, prophecy deals with Jewish or perhaps the Hebrew year. Therefore, it is a matter of months that we cannot determine. It may run until 1931 or even after, if the coincidences as explained on chart page 112 and 113 were not divinely designed to point out this fact. So this statement, brothers and sisters, can be easily understood that B.D. Hotep has no knowledge concerning the Bible calendar. And that is the reason that he plainly declared that he could not be able to point the exact day or month or even the year of the commencement of the 430 years in Ezekiel Chapter 4. It's so because the Bible calendar was not as yet restored in his lifetime or in his days. But he himself declared clearly in tract number 10 on page 38, saying, "Do the nations of today do not follow the biblical monthly calendar, that in no wise alters the fact that the original weekly cycle has never been changed, and as it is entirely independent of both the solar and the lunar calendars, had God not preserved it intact throughout all the ages, the saints now, in the times of restitution of all things, would have great difficulty to restore it and to vindicate its integrity." For sure, the statement to restore it and to vindicate its integrity must be referring only to the biblical monthly calendar. And we already read that the biblical monthly calendar consisted only 30 days every month. And there is no need to restore the weekly cycle due to the fact that it had never been destroyed. It was preserved by God, unbroken line, never been altered, never been changed. And according to that reading in tract number 10, page 38, that the principal reason why God preserved it intact throughout the ages, the weekly cycle, is the only medium that God employed in the restoration of the Bible monthly calendar. So the statement that had God not preserved it intact throughout the ages, the weekly cycle, the saints in the times of restitution of all things would have great difficulty to restore the Bible monthly calendar and to vindicate its integrity. So, in that reading, can be easily understood that in order for the saints to make them more easier to comprehend at the time when the Bible creation calendar will be restored is through the weekly cycle, by which it had never been changed. So, we need to study now closely, brothers and sisters, this prophecy. The focal point of the Bible calendar is that to locate the exact fulfillment of all the time or Bible time prophecy, brothers and sisters. Now, if the primary application of the midnight cry is applied to William Miller, and according to White House Recruiter on page 19, it says here, the only revelation of new prophetic truth subsequent to the Reformation is the announcement of the year in which was to begin the work of cleansing the sanctuary, primarily in behalf of the dead, based on Daniel 8 verse 14, but not then fully understood. As its announcement was made by the first-day Adventists, it necessarily follows that they were the third group of servants with a new and distinctive message, and as is well known, they started proclaiming it in the year 1833, announcing that the cleansing of the sanctuary was to commence in the year 1844. Thus, in 1833, the clock of parabolic time struck the hour of 6, or in our modern time piece of clock, that is 12 noon, brothers and sisters. Now, let us study closely this prophecy. Now, since the message of the midnight cry is concerning the commencement of the cleansing of the sanctuary, which is the message brought by William Miller. I would like to read again in TSR 181, saying, the midnight cry was first proclaimed prior to 1844. And the coming of the bridegroom was Christ coming to the most holy place in the heavenly sanctuary for the investigative judgment of the saints. The investigation being in two sections. First, the judgment for the dead, and the second for the living. The cry must be repeated. Otherwise, we would have no present truth for the time of the judgment of the living. The cry for the living being of a greater importance to the world than the one for the dead. And as the virgins are a figure of the living church, the parable must have a direct application to the church at this present time. The coming of the bridegroom for the judgment of the living. But indirectly, it points back to the commencement of the midnight cry, the first angel's message, the judgment for the dead. The message being of the same event, judgment both for the living and for the dead, are called the midnight cry. The same is proven by the parable itself. To us, our page 181. Now, the voice of inspiration is plainly telling, brothers and sisters, that the midnight cry must be repeated in the judgment for the living, by which in reality it is even more directly applied in the judgment that pertains to the living rather than to the dead. But the announcement of the midnight cry on its primary application, which is the judgment that pertains to the dead, is the commencement of the cleansing of the sanctuary. But the proclamation of the midnight cry in the judgment that pertains to the living, the final phase, is not the commencement, but rather the final Day of Atonement, by which on that Day of Atonement, that is the last and the final Day of Atonement, by which after that Day of Atonement, the cleansing is finished, brothers and sisters. So, that is our focal point in this study. And there is no possibility that we could be able to ascertain clearly when that final Day of Atonement will occur unless the Bible calendar will be restored. Now, since the shepherd's rod declared clearly, let us read again. And to us are 220, saying, is there any way whereby we can determine the time of the opening of the seal and the commencement of the judgment for the living? If God so faithfully revealed to the living the commencement of the judgment for the dead, it cannot be possible that He would keep secret the time of the judgment for the living. If He did, we would have no present truth in the time of the last seal. It says, neither could there be justice in such secrecy, nor could such judgment be legal. Therefore, a revelation of the judgment for the living is of as great importance as the revelation of the gospel itself. For the judgment, which is the blotting out the sins, is the crowning act in the gospel of Christ. Thus, we conclude that when the seal is opened and the judgment for the living begins, we must know it. The Day of Atonement in its type proves the same. For the Israelites were well informed of the event, their duty, and the consequence. Now, I would like to remind again, brothers and sisters, that concerning the opening of the seventh seal, such occurrences occurred in the heavenly sanctuary. And let us distinctly separate the opening of the seventh seal in the holy place and the opening of the seventh seal in the most holy place. The term opening in its actuality in the heavenly sanctuary is the proceedings. The proceedings under the seventh seal is in session. So, and accordingly, in track number 3 on page 18, saying, hence his mediatorial work began first in the holy place, then in the most holy. Track number 3, page 18. So Christ's mediatorial work began first in the holy. The mediatorial work of Jesus Christ, brothers and sisters, in October 22, 1844, in reality is divided into two divisions, holy place and most holy place. Now, I would like to use first general term. In October 22, 1844, commenced the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary. And concerning the term cleansing, that is blotting out of names rather than blotting out of sins. For example, in track number 5, on page 110, it says here, "But why leave out the court? Why not measure it also? For since it is a part of the building, it too must be symbolical of saints. Obviously because it represents the great multitude, which no man could number, measure, of all nations, kindreds and peoples and tongues." Revelation 7 verse 9. The last who come from among the Gentiles. The court, in other words, is symbolical of the immeasurable, meaning innumerable, harvest of second fruits, brought in after the measurable, numerable harvest of first fruits, the 144,000. It is not measured, meaning investigated, because it represents those among whom there are no bed to be cast out, for they are gathered in after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. Daniel 8 verse 14. After the judgment of the dead, after the separation of the bad from among the good in the church, as illustrated by the parable of the net. Matthew 13 verse 47 and 48. They are those who by name, by people, Revelation 18 verse 4, are called to come out of Babylon, and who with no unclean among them, Isaiah 52 verse 1, come into the already purified living church of God. Track number 5, 110 and 111. Now, the statement is very plain. I would like to make a short demonstration. Accordingly, brethren, the great multitude will be converted to the message and gathered into the church. There are three that have been mentioned. It says, it is after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. After the cleansing of the heavenly temple. Second, it says, after the judgment of the dead. That is according to the passage that we read. And the third one is, after the church had been purified. So, that is the statement we read in track number 5, 110. Now, I would like to focus to the first that had been mentioned, after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. Now, the question is that, according to the reading in track number 5, page 110, why is it that the great multitude will no longer be measured? And what does it mean by the statement, they were no longer measured in that statement? Accordingly, in that statement, it says, they are no longer to be measured, meaning investigated. Now, the question is, where? What specific apartment by which the great multitude will no longer be investigated? Is it the most holy place or holy place? Now, for sure, the statement itself says, brethren, that they will no longer be measured or investigated, because at the time when they will be converted to the message, there will be no more bad to be cast out. So, that reading alone indicates that the investigation is pointing to the blotting out of names. So, the blotting out of names is only up to the constituent of the worshippers, brothers and sisters. Now, in connection with that statement, I would like to read track number 5. Here in track number 5, on page 109, it says, and as the measuring is figurative of the same work, so that is pointing to the investigative judgment. I would like to read. The investigative judgment of the dead consequently takes place in the heavenly temple only, whereas the investigative judgment of the living takes place in the heavenly as well as in the earthly temple. While the records are being made up for the books in the heavenly, the people are being investigated for the separation in the earthly. Matthew 22 verse 11 to 13. See Malachi 3 verse 1 to 3. And as the measuring is figurative of the same work, then it leads to the conclusion that the temple, the altar, and them that worship therein must figuratively represent the three classes to be judged. So in this reading, brothers and sisters, the judgment mentioned here is the judgment in the holy place. And what judgment? Blotting out of names. There are only three classes to be judged, to be investigated. Because in page 110, the statement very plain, the great multitude will no longer be investigated. investigated. And we know that the temple, according to 109, it says, thus the temple, the first and the largest object, must represent the first and largest body of righteous dead, those from Adam's time to the beginning of the judgment in 1844. Who are they? They are those who died under the first 5 seals. That is called the temple. So those who died under the first seal, from Adam to the flood, 2SR 221, saying summary of the commencement and termination of seals. So the first 5 seals are those from Adam to the flood, the second seal from flood to Abraham, the third seal from Abraham to Jesus Christ, the fourth seal from Jesus Christ to 1500, and the fifth seal is from 1500 up to 1844, according to this reading in track number 5, 109 and 110. And then the altar must be those who will be resurrected in Daniel 12, verse 2. And as far as the spur prophecies thus concerned, in early writings 285, they are those who died under the faith of the third angel's message since 1844. Now, I would like to read again. It says, while the altar, a spatial and smaller object, must represent a spatial and smaller body of righteous dead, the righteous who die from 1844 on, who are to come up in the spatial resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. And the quotation is early writings, page 285. Those who worship therein, being the living saints, who are to be measured, then can only be the 144,000, those whom the denomination was since 1844 to gather in for translation. Track number 5, pages 109 and 110. So, the only people under the 7th seal that will pass the investigation in the holy place, which is the blotting out of names, are the worshippers under the first fruits or the first harvest. Because the second fruits, when the message will be proclaimed to them, God will no longer allow that there are still names of the wicked to be inscribed in the Lamb's Book of Life. Now, I would like to illustrate, brothers and sisters, and hoping that we could be able to grasp them before we could explain to you the Bible calendar. Now, October 22, 1844, we called it the commencement of the cleansing from the sanctuary, by which such cleansing is referring to the books. Now, brothers and sisters, I would like to, although we will explain it later, that since 2011, I would like to put here, 2011, this is the commencement of the inscribing of the name under the 7th seal. But let us divide the 7th seal into 2 divisions. This is first fruit and this is second fruit. Or we could separate to make it more clearer. For example, this is the book under the first fruit and this is the book under the second fruit. This is the only book under the 7th seal, which is mixed multitude, by which the names that had been entered into this book are contain righteous and the names of the wicked. Therefore, it needs to be cleansed. And this is the last book to be cleansed. There are 7 books to be cleansed since October 22, 1844. That is the first seal, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. The cleansing of the book under the 7th seal cannot begin not until these 6 books will be completely cleansed, or the names of the wicked will be blotted out. After all the names of the wicked blotted out in the first seal, then proceed to the second seal, then proceed to the third seal, proceed to the fourth seal, fifth seal, and sixth seal. And after all the books under the 6 seals, which is pertaining to the dead, are completely cleansed, then the cleansing of the last book under the 7th seal will then commence. And the cleansing of this book is only 1 day of atonement. And after this book will be completely cleansed, and only the names of the 144,000 left into this book, then commence the inscribing of the names in the second fruit. And all the names to be inscribed into this book are only the righteous. No more names of the wicked to be inscribed into this book. And that is the reason why there will be no more investigation into this book. Why? Because there will be no more names to be blotted out. Because the only names to be inscribed into this book are the names of the righteous. So the climactic point of the cleansing is under the seventh seal, but only in the first section. And that is our main goal in this study, brothers and sisters. In all the subject, that is our main goal, to ascertain clearly, brethren, when would that be? But the shepherd's rod already declared that in our reading to SR 220, there is no reason for God to keep it secret forever. Yes, Sister White, Alonzo Jones, Wagoner, B.T. Hotep, they have no knowledge when would be the cleansing of that book under the seventh seal, due to the fact that they are not the people. The statement in 2 TJ 12:30 saying, to the people that they need to know that their cases are on trial. And I would like to emphasize again and again, brethren, that the blotting out of sins is the crowning act in the gospel of Jesus Christ. 2SR 220. And the term crowning act indicates that you win victoriously. Or in other words, since, brothers and sisters, you have been able to do to all your best, successfully, you have been able to retain your names in the Lamb's Book of Life, then you will be crowned. And that crowning act, your sins, for sure, will be blotted out. So that is very plain, brothers and sisters. Now, I would like to read first to you the statement in 1934 edition in track number 3. Here in track number 3, supplement 1934 edition. On page 75, and it says, comparison of the two Pentecosts. The comparisons of the two Pentecosts are perfect. The first fruits only of both being numbered 120 in the one and 144,000 in the other. The innumerable company that was brought into the church after the Pentecost foreshadowed the great multitude of the final harvest, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues. Now, we need to analyze closely, brothers and sisters. Pentecost will fall only on the third month. Because Pentecost, that is the 50th day from the time by which the wave ship had been offered. So, it is also closely connected to the subject, the wave ship and the wave lobes. But for sure, there are 7 Pentecosts, brothers and sisters, by which, since we have 7 days in a week, so there must be 7 different dates of Pentecost. Now, for example, the Pentecost in the days of the apostles, that was June 7, 31 AD. But the Pentecost in the days of Noah is June 6, 2464 BC. We will discuss that portion on the subject, the wave ship and the wave lobes. But just to emphasize that Pentecost always fall on the third month. We commonly called as the month of June. Right? So that is the month by which the Pentecost will be fulfilled. Now, according to this reading, brothers and sisters, let us read 1934 tract 3, page 75. It says, the typical wave lobes, which signified the completion of the first fruit harvest, Leviticus 23 verse 17, were baken with leaven to symbolize that the sins were not blotted out at the time the servants of our God were sealed. Hence, the investigative judgment for the living blotting out the sins will begin after the sealing of the 144,000, the spiritual wave lobes, and after the outpouring of the Spirit. The leaven may have a still deeper meaning. Now, I would like to make a short demonstration or illustration. So, according to our reading, that at the time when the 144,000 received the outpouring of the Holy Ghost, just an illustration, and we already explained that Pentecost always fall on the third month, the month of June. Now, so I would like to place first question mark, and later on we could locate exactly at the time when you could be able to comprehend the Bible calendar. So this is the Pentecost to the 144,000 living saints. But after the Pentecost, they will proclaim the message into a loud cry to the great multitude which no man could number, according to our reading. But the shepherd's rod says that at this time, when the Pentecostal power was poured out to the 144,000 living saints, in that reading in 1934, tract 3, page 75, the sins of the 144,000 at that time are not yet blotted out. We know that the blotting out of sins is in October 10. Now, I would like to place again question mark. So, from the time the 144,000 living saints received the Pentecostal power, at least, brothers and sisters, so then June, July, August, September, October. June, July, August, September, October. More or less, there are still 5 months before their sins are blotted out. So the outpouring of the Holy Ghost, the Pentecostal power to the 144,000 living saints, precedes the blotting out of sins. So the leaven, brothers and sisters, represent the righteousness of Christ imputed in their behalf. Because once their sins are blotted out, that is already called the imparted righteousness. And we know that according to the voice of inspiration, brothers and sisters, there are 2 phases of righteousness: imputed and imparted righteousness. So the leaven represent that the righteousness of Christ is imputed in their behalf. So the Pentecostal power will be poured out to the 144,000 living saints before their sins were blotted out, according to the voice of inspiration. So, brothers and sisters, remember, we already read in track number 5, 110 and 111 that at the time when the 144,000 proclaimed the message to the great multitude, that is after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. But at the time that they proclaimed the message to the great multitude, even the sins of the 144,000 are not yet blotted out. How much more to the great multitude which no man could number? So in that evidences, we can declare clearly that the cleansing of the sanctuary, in its strictest sense, does not refer to the blotting out of names, brothers and sisters. Because at the time when the message is proclaimed to the great multitude, which no man could number, according to a reading in track number 5, 110 and 111, that is after the cleansing of the heavenly temple. But during that time, the conversion of the great multitude to the message, the blotting out of sins are still onward, still in progress. So to repeat again, brothers and sisters, the cleansing of the sanctuary in its strictest sense is referring only to the blotting out of names. As also is stated in track number 3, page 73, page 74, it says, being the Day of Atonement in type for both the dead and the living, this service of the earthly tabernacle therefore projects the Day of Atonement in its antitype. The cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven from unworthy names in the books. So that is the cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven, cleansing, blotting out all unworthy names in the books, and the cleansing of the church on earth from its unconverted and unstable members, thus bringing the time of clean books. So the statement, bringing the time of clean books, pertaining to the Lamb's books of life, because that is the only books needs to be cleansed, the Lamb's books of life, which is a mixed multitude in track number 3 on page 7, saying that not every name that has been entered into the Lamb's books. Why is it that it is inscribed in plural form? Because it is divided into 7 books, as stated and demonstrated by the subject, the 7 seals. And the shepherd's rod says that each seal is consecutively broken. Now, I would like to read track number 15 on page 10, saying, it being in 7 sections, each section individually sealed. So it was separated into 7 different books, by which each section is individually sealed. 7 seals in all are consecutively broken, permitting each section to unfold its own contents. Track number 15, page 10. But we are still focusing to the subject, the cleansing of the sanctuary, by which I think that is one of the most important part of the restoration of the Bible calendar. So, the statement in 2SR 220 saying, is there any way whereby we can determine the opening of the last seal or the commencement of the judgment for the living? And I think the answer is, there is no possibility that we could understand the opening of the seventh seal and the commencement of the judgment for the living unless the Bible calendar must be restored first. Of course, such restoration cometh from God. And only God knows the seasons and the times. In 11 Symbolic Code, number 3, page 5, I would like to read a statement. It says that present truth comes only from God. Man does not know the seasons, and therefore God Himself must appoint the time for present truth to be revealed. So we as human beings, we did not know the seasons. Only God knows when to reveal such very important truth and more pertaining to the restoration of the Bible calendar. There must be an absolute reason why God did not reveal it to Sister White and Betty Hotep. First, because of the type. In 1SR 226, the types themselves are not the true object, no more than a photograph is, but it is a representation which pictures an unmistakable evidence, the object in view. That's why in 1SR 124 it says, the picture tells the story, symbols do not lie. So one of the reasons why God did not reveal it to Betty Hotep as well as Sister White, because they were living in a time typifying ancient Israel while they were still in Egypt. And Betty Hotep himself declared here in 1SR 115 and 116, it says, we begin with the 4th verse and onward. We shall later take the first 3 and last 2 verses. After Israel, after the flesh, was a type of Israel by the promise, 144,000, as explained on pages 64 to 113. The experience of the children of Israel in Egypt, so the experience of the children of Israel while they were still in Egypt, was a photograph of our denomination, and their experience is being reproduced in every particular with these people. Is being reproduced in every particular with these people. So to repeat again, brothers and sisters, the picture tells the story that while ancient Israel were still living in Egypt, God did not reveal to them the Bible calendar or creation calendar. In other terms, it is called the antediluvian calendar because that is the first period of the church. According to tract number 2, we know that the church is divided into 3 periods. It says in tract number 2, page 13, and the fact that there is a 3rd period presupposes 2 preceding periods, making in all 3 great divisions of time. The first from creation to the flood, that is the antediluvian world. The second from the flood to the crucifixion of Christ. And the third from the crucifixion to His second coming, which is the Christian era. So here in 2SR 247, it says, the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month was the date of the solar year according to the antediluvian calendar. And in 248, it says, this fact proves that the antediluvian monthly calendar consisted of 30 days to a month. That is the antediluvian monthly calendar, which is called the Bible creation calendar. Now, one of the prominent objects in view, brothers and sisters, why God take out His people from Egypt is to observe the feast in the wilderness. That is very plain in Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Now, brethren, although we need more to study different subjects, but I do fully believe that the subject will be even more easier to comprehend through faith. Faith is the key that unlocks the door, brothers and sisters. Now, I would like to read to you to connect our subject to the parable in Matthew 20. Because one of the reasons, according to 2SR 234, it says, why only 2 kinds of cereals brought to view? Why not 5? The 2 cereals are sufficient to illustrate the thought and to clear the lesson. But the chief reason for only 2 is to draw attention to the first and last calls. because reference is made of but two Israels, namely Israel after the flesh, the descendants of Abraham, and Israel after the spirit, the 144,000. But the object of the lesson is for the latter who are hard at the 11th hour, for the truth of the parable has never been understood by any other company. Now, I would like only to focus to the statement that the reason why God uses only two kinds of cereals in Revelation 6 verse 6 in connection with the parable in Matthew 20 according to 2SR 225-226 is to draw our attention to the first and the last call. The first call is Israel after the flesh going out of Egypt. Now, let's read the last paragraph in 2SR 234. It says, now the question why the bow is from the throne, 1 measure of wheat for a penny, first, and 3 measures of barley for a penny. Last will be answered. Humanly speaking, it should have been the reverse. For by the wheat is represented the last message, 11th hour, and by the barley, the first early in the morning, Israel going out of Egypt. So that is very plain here in 2SR 234. The first call is Israel after the flesh going out of Egypt. So our subject must be to the last, by which the most particular object in view, pointing to antitypical Israel after the spirit, the promise, going out of Egypt. Now, let us read again the statement here, brothers and sisters. Here in 1SR on page 101, saying, it has been made clear that Israel after the flesh is a photograph of Israel by the promise. In the Exodus movement, all the tribes went out of Egypt. If this is a photograph of Israel by the promise, then all the 12 tribes must come out now as well. But that statement, must come out now as well, is pointing to the predicted event. It can be applied in the days of Pentecost because he himself declared clearly that the perfect fulfillment, it says here in 2SR 275, saying, but the perfect fulfillment of the prophetic period of Abraham in its antitype is yet in the future, going out of Egypt. It is still in the future, going out of Egypt. And in page 64, the prophet declared clearly, brothers and sisters, saying, the experience of the Israelites in departing from Egypt was written for the instruction of those who should live in the last days. Before the overflowing scourge shall come upon the dwellers of the earth, the Lord calls upon all who are Israelites indeed to prepare for that event. Now, how could we be able to prepare that event, brothers and sisters, unless we knew when would it be? And how could we be able to know that antitypical Passover unless the Bible calendar will be restored? Now, I would like to read in answerer number 3 on page 11, saying, and so it is the Passover, the Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, the 3 most important feasts in the year. I would like to emphasize that reading, that the Passover, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles are the 3 most important feasts in the year. So that is the Passover, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles, the most important feast of the year. Now, for example, brothers and sisters, the Feast of Tabernacles, the shepherd's rod plainly declared in track number 3, pages 81 and page 82, although we will discuss this portion in more detail on the subject, the wave sheep and the wave lobes. Now, I would like to read track number 3, page 81, page 82. As the wave sheep and the wave lobes are typical, then also the Feast of Tabernacles must be typical. Otherwise, the ceremony would not have been observed as a part of the harvest rite. And as in the type, the feast was to be celebrated at the close of the final ingathering of the year's harvest, then correspondingly, in the antitype, it must be celebrated at the close of the final ingathering of the earth's harvest, which is nearing its fulfillment. So the time consumed in producing and in offering the wave sheep and the wave loaves, also in observing the Feast of Tabernacles, is representative of the entire spiritual harvest time of the living and of the dead. Bearing out this fact, the Spirit prophecy says, the Feast of Tabernacles was not only commemorative but typical. It celebrated the ingathering of the fruits of the earth and pointed forward to the great day of final ingathering, when the Lord of the harvest shall send forth his reapers to gather the tares together in bundles for the fire, and to gather the wheat into his garner. At that time the wicked will all be destroyed. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 541. Plainly, therefore, since the first and the second fruits of the literal harvest and its attendant rites foreshadowed a spiritual harvest of first and second fruits, they are to be climaxed by the antitypical Feast of Tabernacles. I saw the saints, says the servant of the Lord, in describing this celebration, leaving the cities and villages and associating together in companies and living in the most solitary places. Angels provided them food and water, while the wicked were suffering from hunger and thirst. Early Writings, page 282. Now, here the shepherd's rod made it so plain in tract number 3, pages 81 and page 82, that such predicted event when God's people leave the cities and villages, that is in the week of the Feast of Tabernacles. So, in order for us to locate that period of time, brothers and sisters, it is in absolute importance, the restoration of the Bible calendar. And I do fully believe that since such restoration and information coming from God, God would not bestow such understanding if the fulfillment of such predicted event is still in a far distant future. Now, since brothers and sisters, according to the voice of inspiration, there are three most important events recorded in Answerer number 3, page 11. It is the Passover, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, for sure, what is the most important event in the Passover? That is pointing to the antitypical Israel going out of Egypt. What is the most important event of that Day of Atonement? That is the final Day of Atonement, the blotting out of names. The one we read in tract number 3, page 73 and page 74, saying, blotting out all the unworthy names in the Lamb's Book of Life, thus bringing the time of clean books. That is, brothers and sisters, the most important event. Although the commencement of the cleansing of the sanctuary is called important event, but it is even more important to know the final and the last Day of Atonement. That pertains to the congregation of the living. Remember, brethren, in 2SR 164, reading again the statement, that while the investigation for the congregation of the dead is in progress, there can be no separation among the congregation of the living. 2SR page 164. Or in other words, while the blotting out of names under the first 6 seals is still unfinished, not yet completely ended, there is no blotting out of names under the congregation of the living. And brothers and sisters, I do fully believe that I would like to illustrate first. For example, this is the final Day of Atonement that pertains to the dead under the 6th seal. October 10. So this is the final Day of Atonement, blotting out of names under the 6th seal. So in October 11, that is the commencement of the investigative judgment for the living. Investigative judgment for the living. And then, on the next Day of Atonement, October 10, this is the blotting out of names under the congregation of the living. And it is called executive judgment. So there must be 360 days. And it is called by the shepherd's rod, the acceptable year of the Lord. After this final Day of Atonement, blotting out of names, no, it is no longer acceptable year of the Lord to the spiritual Israel, brothers and sisters. So that is the final blotting out of names. And we stated it several times that this coming Day of Atonement, brothers and sisters, is no longer pertaining to the dead, but it is already pertaining to the living. you and I, brothers and sisters. And I would like to read again the statement in Untitled number 18, page 20 and page 21. It says, in the terms of the parables, all this can be summed as follows: those who successfully aim to be spurred as with. So the question is, do you have that aim in your life today? Aim is the same with goal or desire. What is that statement in volume 4, page 17? An aimless life is a living death. Aimless life. And the most important aim supposed to be is to be spared as with. What does it mean? To let our names remain there in the Lamb's Book of Life. I am not weary, brothers and sisters, to remind again and again. The shepherd's rod declared clearly in 2 7, page 10 and 11, what a solemn time we have come to, brothers, sisters. Do you realize that if you do not now make an effort to put your name in the book, it may be forever too late? And is it not better to have your name there, even if the trouble were 100 years in the future? Now is the time to act. Now is the day of salvation brought to you. Today inspiration pleads, if you hear His voice, harden not your hearts. Only those who heed the revealed word of God will find deliverance and peace. None others will. I know, brothers and sisters, it's really hard to explain this subject, Bible calendar, because it contains a lot of computation. But every day, I'm praying to my God and studying how I could be able to share to you, to explain to you in more easier and more comprehensible that this coming Day of Atonement is the final Day of Atonement, the blotting out of names. And how I could be able to share to you that you could be able to comprehend it easier, the Bible calendar. And I'm trying my best to give you the general knowledge, brothers and sisters. Now, here in 1 TG number 18, page 20, it says, in the terms of the parables, all this can be summed up as follows. Those who successfully aim to be spurred as with, as good fish, and to put on the wedding garment, are those who have found the field of great treasure and the pearl of great price, and have done all to purchase them. We repeated several times, brothers and sisters, that the field, it is the church. According to Christ's Object Lesson, page 70, the field in the Bible, although it says the world, but it can be understood that it is the church of Christ in the world. Christ's Object Lesson, page 70. Now, if you will read track number 3 on page 54, saying, the seed sower, the seed, the field, the season of cultivation and growing, and the season of harvest must together be perfectly calculated to illustrate the spiritual kingdom. Otherwise, the representation can only lead into error instead of into truth. It seems that in this reading, the seed sower, the seed, the field, the season of cultivation and growing, and the season of harvest, all these things must together be perfectly calculated. So let us enumerate one by one. First, the seed sower. Second, the seed. Third, the field. Fourth, the season of cultivation and growing. And fifth, the season of harvest. These 5 must together be perfectly calculated. To illustrate what? To illustrate the spiritual kingdom. And we stated several times that the spiritual kingdom is not the literal premillennial kingdom. Only those who will be a part of that spiritual kingdom can be a part of that literal premillennial kingdom. So the kingdom mentioned in 2TG number 44, page 44, it is the spiritual kingdom. By which, according to the shepherd's rod, that spiritual kingdom is not accompanied by great signs and wonders, by noise and pomp, brothers and sisters. 2TG number 44, page 44. It says, are the efforts to set up the premillennial kingdom, the purified church, accompanied by great signs and wonders, by noise and pomp. To this question, the Lord answers in the parable of Matthew 13:31 to 33. And it's concerning the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the woman who hid 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. And it points out to the Pentecost, the time when it is leavened, brothers and sisters. And to repeat again, it says here, not a blast or a boom, and not a bush either, but the plain, quiet truth, brothers, sisters, is what saves you and brings the kingdom into being. This is pointing to the spiritual kingdom by which it is not accompanied by great signs and wonders, by noise and pomp. Unlike with the literal premillennial kingdom, according to 2TG number 3, page 7, it is accompanied by great signs and wonders. Here in 2TG number 3, page 7, it says, all these wonders you see, the Lord performs in the land of Israel and in the sight of the heathen. These are necessarily premillennial events. The term premillennial, that is, the occurrences that takes place before the millennium. But there is a thing by which it is not common and it is not popular among shepherds rod believers. That is the spiritual kingdom, brothers and sisters. Because the only thing which is common to them is the literal pre-millennial kingdom. But concerning the spiritual kingdom, which is illustrated by the parable of the mustard seed. So it is involved the seed sower in track number 3, page 54. The seed sower, and second, the seed. What is the seed? The mustard seed. The field. What is the field? The church. So that seed, which is represented by the mustard seed, that is the present truth, which is the smallest in the present truth represented by the 7 seals. That is the present truth under the last seal. According to 2TG number 11 on page 6, let us read the statement. It says, mustard seed being the smallest of all seeds, this parable shows that which is to start the kingdom will be very insignificant. So the beginning of the establishing of the kingdom is very insignificant. Because even in the illustration, as stated in track number 3 on page 54 and page 55, it says, this parable, therefore, illustrate by the 12 months of the year a period of gospel history. It is concerning the 12 figurative months, in the closing of which the kingdom of Christ is to be set up, and the beginning of which is the seed sowing time. The beginning of that setting of God's kingdom is the seed sowing time. It did not say the seeds as of many, but only one. That is the mustard seed. And it is, of course, in literal aspects. If the mustard seed is already at the bottom of the soil, you can see nothing. That is the illustration. But that is the beginning of the kingdom of God. Very insignificant. There is no material side. You can see nothing. And we explained it several times that the only one who knew that there is a seed in that field that had been planted at the bottom of the soil, the only one who knew it is the seed sower. And that is Jesus Christ. Therefore, for sure, to the 144,000 living saints, it is Jesus Christ who will inform them through the power of His Spirit that they could be able to ascertain clearly, as illustrated in the parable, they found out the field, by which in that field, the pearl of a great price had been planted by Jesus Christ. And they done all in order to purchase that field. And look at this statement. In 2TG number 11, page 6, it says, mustard seed being the smallest of all seeds, this parable shows that which is to start the kingdom will be very insignificant, contrary to all human expectation. Nevertheless, like the mustard plant becomes the biggest of all herbs, so the kingdom shall grow and become the greatest of all kingdoms. This being contrary to all human planning, it is but natural that those who are like Nicodemus and continue to be ashamed to be identified with something that is unpopular, hated, and insignificant will as a result be left out of the kingdom. So this group of people, represented by the field, brothers and sisters, they were unpopular. Not only unpopular, but they had been hated. And they were insignificant. But those who will be ashamed to be a part of these people, as a result, they will be left out of the kingdom. Brothers and sisters, I would like to read first this verse and focus to our main subject. And to repeat again, we need to completely realize that this coming Day of Atonement is the most critical, and it is called the Great and Dreadful Day of the Lord. What is the Great and Dreadful Day of the Lord, by the way? In track number 4, let me read to you first. On pages 60 and page 61, it says here, in an effort to save our brethren from the imminent vengeance of God, the great and dreadful day of the Lord. What is the great and dreadful day of the Lord? It is the imminent vengeance of God. Now, for example, brothers and sisters, I would like to read this reading in 1 TG number 42, page 10. It says, you certainly now see Zion's reward and God's mighty effort, that is the mighty effort of God, to inform you of this truth. To inform you of this truth. You surely will do all you can to escape God's vengeance and to join this Laymans movement for the gathering of the people. It is God who informed each one of us, brothers and sisters, that if you want to escape God's vengeance, you must join Laymans movement. Now here in 1 TG 21, page 15, it says here, you must therefore not fail to wholeheartedly and actually join this mighty Laymans movement for revival and reformation throughout Laodicea, and to finish the gospel work with a church fair as the moon, clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners. She is to go forth into all the world, conquering and to conquer. Prophets and Kings, page 725. You cannot afford to lose out. In this reading, in 2 TG 21, page 15, we can easily discern that this predicted Laymans movement is represented by the woman, saying, fair as the moon, clear as the sun. She is to go forth. So the feminine gender given by the voice of inspiration, plainly indicating that it must be pointing to the church, represented by the woman. The shepherd's rod plainly declared, brethren, in 2 SR, page 261, it says, to John was shown the true spiritual church of God in all ages in a symbol of a woman. So the admonition given by the voice of inspiration in track number 14 on page 22, saying, brothers and sisters, here in prophetic utterance is not only a promise to purify the church when modern Assyria is being crushed, but also a suggestive statement as to what constitute meat in due season for men today, and as to what movement they are to enlist in if they would make sure of salvation. Track number 14, page 22. If you want to make sure of your salvation, the only way that you could rest assured that that movement, that church is the true church of God, you need to study it in a symbol of a woman. Now, brothers and sisters, not all churches recorded in the Bible are called woman. There are 10 candlesticks recorded in the Bible according to 2SR 284. But among the 10 candlesticks, 5 of them are called woman, but 5 of them were not. And that is Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia. Lutherans, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and the First-day Adventists. All these churches are raised by God, but have these churches never been called by inspiration as woman. Why? Because according to 2SR 268, it says here, let us read the statement given by the voice of inspiration. The foregoing explanation answers one of our questions. The Protestant churches which were raised up before the woman returned from the wilderness were in total darkness concerning the sanctuary service. Therefore, they are not represented by the woman or by the temple. For as we stated before, the typical temples represent both sections of the church with two divine laws, namely the moral and ceremonial. Thus, the woman represents a church that keep the commandments of God, moral law, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ, ceremonial law, or the plan of salvation revealed in the light of the spirit of prophecy. Revelation 12, verse 17. 2SR page 268. So the statement is very plain, brothers and sisters, that why is it that those candlesticks represented by the Lutherans, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and the First-day Adventists, all of them are not called woman? Because the only church that can be called woman must be the church by which unto them was bestowed the daily and the sanctuary. And since there are only 10 candlesticks recorded in the Bible, so there must be only 10. Among the 10, there must be only 5 candlesticks, which is called woman. The first, the Jewish church, represented by the first candlestick in Revelation 11, verse 3. Second, the Apostolic Church. The second candlestick in Revelation 11, verse 3 and 4. The third one, the Ephesus. The fourth, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The golden candlestick, the last golden candlestick in Revelation 3. The fifth, the golden candlestick in Zechariah chapter 4. Now, brothers and sisters, the voice of inspiration clearly declared in 2 Symbolic Code number 10, page 4. Accordingly, brothers and sisters, that saying consequently, the church from 1844 is divided into 2 sections. The church before the loud cry and the church in the time of the loud cry. We explain it several times in track number 8, pages 47, page 48, saying, why David a type? Inevitably because he is the only one that typified the church in the time of the loud cry. That the leadership which will rise up in 1844 typifies soul, or it is antitypical soul. Therefore, the church in the time of the loud cry is typifying David, the 8th church in the New Testament succession. Although we explained it several times in Answerer number 1, page 33, that the house of David, the 8th church in the New Testament succession, will not exist, not until the succession of his 7 brothers will pass one by one. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church cannot be called as one of the 7 brothers of David, because the shepherd's rod made it so plain in track number 8, page 48, that the Seventh-day Adventist leadership that was raised in 1844 is antitypical soul, and soul is not a brother of David. And it is very plain in this study. The movement that was raised in 1930 to 1955 is our father, antitypical Jesse. And then, number 7 indicates completeness. All the Davidian within the 2-horn-based domain in the United States of America is represented by the 7 antitypical brothers of David. Because, brothers and sisters, the predicted woman is in the wilderness, not in the vineyard. Because that woman, as described in Revelation chapter 12, which is clothed with the sun, according to the voice of inspiration, we have type and antitype. The type is the woman in the wilderness, at the time when the creation calendar was restored, bestowed unto them. And one of the strongest proof that that predicted woman cannot be found in the United States of America is the restoration of the Bible calendar. Because as type being the unmistakable evidence that pictured out the particular object in view, the creation calendar was restored when God's people went out of Egypt. The author says that is still future in his days. And here in 2SR, page 75, therefore the woman clothed with the son and travailing with child is the period after Israel went out of Egypt. But that is the primary application. Why? Because when Israel went out of Egypt, it is illustrated early in the morning. Whereas the illustration of the woman in Revelation 12, clothed with the sun, when the sun is in her full strength, 12 noon. And that is one of the reason why the midnight cry is primarily applied in the days of William Miller, brothers and sisters. Because the final and application must be in the judgment that pertains to the living, as is stated in 2SR 181. Because according to 1SR, the voice of inspiration declared clearly, brothers and sisters, here in 1SR on page 15, I would like to read again the statement that 3 angels of Revelation 14 are flying in the midst of heaven, or where the sun stands at noon. 1SR page 15. This statement cannot be applied in the days of William Miller, although William Miller had been called by God at noon. But William Miller has no knowledge concerning the third angel. The proclamation of the third angel commenced after the disappointment. And it is primarily applied to Sister White, because Sister White, or the Seventh-day Adventist movement, had been called at 3 p.m., brothers and sisters. So, the parable in Matthew 25 is called Midnight Cry. But it is the final application of the third angel's message by which it must be proclaimed at 12 noon, according to 1SR page 15. So, on the spiritual side, brothers and sisters, as illustrated on the material side, in early writings, page 285, I would like to emphasize this reading, saying that it was at midnight that God chose to deliver His people. As the wicked were mocking around them, suddenly the sun appeared, shining in His strength, and the moon stood still. That is the illustration of Revelation 12, verse 1. The moon is under the feet of the woman, stood still, and the woman is clothed with the sun. So if the 3 hours interval, I would like to read to you here in 2SR 237, reason why 3 hours to a movement. It says, the following fact further proves that the church history in this instance is represented by 12-hour clock dial. If the call came to Israel early in the morning and at the 12th hour, and the day closed at the following 12-hour call day, because the written word of God was in existence for light to the church, that the period that preceded the Bible is symbolically called night. Some may question the evidence for allowing 3 hours to each incident, from creation to the fall of Adam, and again to Enoch and Noah. If God worked on the 3-hour schedule with the crucifixion of Jesus, see chart on page 22, and the same rule was followed in the period called day, then He certainly would not follow another rule in the period called night. The reason He has followed that particular rule is to present to His church the exact time of her history by periods. Although we will deal this subject in more detail in another subject, and maybe we will attach this study on the subject, the 12 figurative months, or even to the subject, the opening of the 7th seal. But I would like to focus to the statement that the principal reason why Jesus Christ followed that particular rule, what is the particular rule? 3 hours schedule, is to present to His church the exact time of her history by periods. Brothers and sisters, we need to understand clearly the exact time of her history by periods. In reality, that statement is applied to the 11th hour church, because the shepherd's rod made it so plain, brethren, that the truth of the parable never been understood by any other company. It says here in 2SR 234, but the object of the lesson is for the latter, who are hired at the 11th hour, for the truth of the parable has never been understood by any other company. So whatever the truth of the parable, brothers and sisters, it is pertaining to the particular object in view, brothers and sisters, by which Hotep being not a part of that 11th hour servants, because according to White House Recruiter, page 28, the 11th hour servants, they are the 144,000 living saints. And as stated in answerer number 5, page 89, that those who died can never be a part of the 144,000. Therefore, Hotep could never be a part of the 144,000 living saints. So whatever understanding that was given by God to Hotep is not the particular object in view. And as stated in tract number 5, page 32 and 34, it is only the groundwork, not the particular object in view. And whatever that particular object in view, such understanding will be given by God only to the 11th hour call, the 11th hour church, the last church in the New Testament, the last section of the church, the 8th section, brothers and sisters. And one of the principal reasons why Jesus Christ followed that particular rule in the crucifixion, 3-hour schedule, is to present to his church their exact time of their history by periods. And that is pointing to the 11th hour church. Who will present it? Jesus Christ. And to whom he will present? To his church. What church? The 11th hour church. And there is no reason that those who will be a part of this church, 11th hour church, they could not comprehend the presentation of Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is a powerful God, brothers and sisters. Now let us go back again to our reading. The statement in 1TG, number 8, on page 25, saying, let's read, in that day, in the day this purification takes place, the gospel work is to be quickly finished by having every member of the Lord's house call his neighbor to his own patch of land, to that which God has preordained that everyone should have. Every member, therefore, is to be a missionary in one capacity or in another. This indeed is the Laymans movement that shall finish the gospel work. Now, we already read in 2TG 21, page 15, that, brothers and sisters, who is that Laymans movement? That is the church predicted in the Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verse 10, as explained by Prophets and Kings, page 725. Now, we can connect one passage to another. Now, for example, in White House Recruiter, page 39, it is quoted there concerning that woman in Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verse 10. Now, let us read White House Recruiter, page 39. It says here, brothers and sisters, all who have perused these pages to this point have surely become aware of the fact that even this very restricted representation of the additional message, that of the judgment of the living, gives in itself tremendous power and force to the three angels' messages. Early Writings, page 277. But in what way is it to give absolute power and force to them? First, by bringing to light the heretofore unrevealed aspects of the judgment, and then subsequently by freeing God's people from both sin and sinners, thereby bringing into existence the long-looked-for purified church that looketh forth as the morning, fair as the moon, clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners. Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verse 10. Prophets and Kings, page 725. A veritable powerhouse indeed. White House Recruiter, page 39. So the voice of inspiration is plainly telling here in White House Recruiter, page 39. It must be pointing to the group of people by which unto them was revealed all the aspects that pertains to the judgment. All unrevealed aspects that pertains to the judgment. Now, I would like to cite to you one of the aspects which was not revealed by God to be the author. And he himself plainly declared that he has no knowledge. Now, I would like to read answerer number 1 on page 94 and 95. It says, in the statement in question, the rod has no reference to the investigative judgment. The message sets no date, either exact or approximate, for the closing of the judgment of the dead and for the beginning of the judgment of the living. The time of the cessation of the one event and the beginning of the other is not to be known until the one is past and the other begun. Now, let us analyze closely the statement given by the prophet Hotep. he plainly declared that he has no knowledge when the judgment of the dead will close and when does the judgment of the living begins. And this was written in 1944. So, in 1944, the prophet plainly told us that he has no knowledge. And the prophet also says that the time of the cessation of the one event and the beginning of the other is not to be known until the one is past and the other begun. So, the prophet is now telling you and I how our Almighty God will reveal. It is after the one is past and the other is moving forward. Now, we already explained to you, brothers and sisters, that the statement in 2SR 164 saying, while the investigation of the congregation of the dead are still in progress, there can be no separation among the congregation of the living. And then it says, but when our high priest shall begin the atonement for the living, there must be a message of present truth, sounding of the trumpet, urging everyone to lay hold on the Lamb of God, which is Jesus Christ, by which in figure come to the sanctuary, confess his sin, and secure his life. Unless the close of the judgment for the dead and the commencement for the living be made known to us, we would have no present truth while the judgment for the living is in session. So that is very plain, brothers and sisters. According to 2SR page 164, neither would such judgment be legal or just. And he who fails to respond to the heavenly summons will be left without the seal or covering of God. Therefore, they must be cut off, as prefigured in the typical Day of Atonement. So that statement is perfectly corroborating to the statement in Answerer number 1, page 94 and 95. B.T. Hotep has no knowledge. Why? Because he himself knew it beforehand that such revelation must be revealed by God when the one is past. What is the one is past? The same with the statement. 2SR 164. While the investigation of the congregation of the dead is still in progress, there can be no separation among the congregation of the living. Or in other words, not until the one is past. What is the one that is past? The blotting out of names that pertains to the dead. It did not say when the one was past, because the verb is always indicate present, meaning when the one is past, presently finished. And the mere fact that it was revealed to God this very year 2020, I would like to explain, brothers and sisters. Last Day of Atonement, that was in Bible calendar, October 10, 2021. But I would like to place it in Gregorian calendar, that was April, I would like to place April 2, 2020, or April 1 and April 2. This is Gregorian. Last April 2, 2020, that is the last blotting out of names under the sixth seal. Last blotting out of names. The one is past, meaning presently finished. The one is past. Last Day of Atonement. Brothers and sisters, it was finished. And we will explain to you through Bible calendar. And that's why, since the coming Day of Atonement is getting nearer and nearer, brothers and sisters, it is even more necessary for me to give you the exact date, the last Day of Atonement, which pertain to the dead. And we are now coming face to face the Day of Atonement, October 10, 2022 in Bible calendar, but in Gregorian calendar, that is March 27 or March 28, 2021. So this coming March, that is the blotting out of names under the congregation that pertains to the living. And if you will continually listening, brothers and sisters, you will understand it gradually, brothers and sisters, by the knowledge of the restoration of the Bible calendar. Now, let us read again the statement. Answerer number 1. Let us go to page 95. It says, as to the 1931 date and the event connected with it, we have no further light at the present time than is to be found in the Shepherd's Rod, Volume 1, page 108 to 114, and Volume 2, page 275. It was at the close of 1930 and the beginning of 1931 that the publication of the message in the rod took place, revealing the truth of the 144,000 and calling for a reformation. So while it was not exactly understood beforehand what the nature of the event would be, yet when the fullness of the time came and no other event occurred but this one, it was thereby identified as the one predicted in Ezekiel Chapter 4 in connection with the end of the 430 prophetic years when the scroll was to unroll another turn. I know, brothers and sisters, the 430 prophetic years is a very broad subject. Now, for example, but the shepherd's rod is plainly telling, brothers and sisters, that Hotep did not exactly understood the nature of the event. That is very plain in his statement. But the prophet says, but when the fullness of the time came, and no other event occurred but this one, no other event. The only event is pointing to the blotting out of names. And it says, it was thereby identified as the one predicted in Ezekiel chapter 4. Now, I would like to introduce to you. First, here in 1SR, on page 116, it says, if there are 430 years connected with Israel after the flesh, then the same period of time must be connected with the true. Who are they represented by the true? That is Israel by promise, or it is called the true object, right? Now, for example, let us read a statement given by the shepherds, brothers and sisters. And 144,000 spiritual Israel is called the true. Page 67 in 1SR. We shall endeavor to bring enough evidence in this study to show that Israel's experience in Egypt is a photograph of Israel, the true, the 144,000 in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. While the Exodus movement was a great movement, the Second Advent movement will be still greater. God will take out a people, not from one nation only, but from every nation under heaven, and He will lead them into the heavenly Canaan. This Advent movement, of which the Exodus movement was a type, we believe was foretold in prophecy in the following stirring language. So in this reading, it says, who are they? Israel the true? The 144,000. Now let's go back again to the reading in 1SR 116. And if there are 430 years connected with Israel after the flesh, what is the 430 years connected with Israel after the flesh? That is found in Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12, let us read the 430 years mentioned here. It says, verse 40 and verse 41. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self-same day, it came to pass that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 and verse 41. And B.T. Hotep says we need to prepare for that event. So the shepherd's rod says here in 1SR page 116, and if there are 430 years connected with Israel after the flesh, then the same period of time must be connected with the true. Who are the true? In page 67, the 144,000 spiritual Israel, the living saints that will no longer to taste death. And the shepherd's rod plainly declared in 2SR 275, but the perfect fulfillment of Abraham in its antitype going out of Egypt is still future. Still future in the days of B.T. Hotep. Now, let us read again the statement in 1SR 116. It says, if there are 430 years connected with Israel after the flesh, then the same period of time must be connected with the true. The same period of time must be connected with the true. The 430-year period by Abraham did not have to do only with ancient Israel, but with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as well. Now, brothers and sisters, remember, Isaac never been in Egypt. Only Abraham and Jacob. So let us distinctly separate now the representation of Abraham, the representation of Isaac, and the representation of Jacob. Type and antitype should exactly fit and perfectly match. Now, the voice of inspiration says that, no, the 430-year period by Abraham. If you will say the 430-year period by Abraham, then it is not Ezekiel chapter 4. The 430-year period by Abraham is divided into two divisions, 30 plus 400. Whereas the 430 years by Ezekiel, it is 390 plus 40, right? And that is very plain, as is stated in page 114. I would like to read 1SR page 114. It says, so the prophecy to Abraham was made in two sections, first being 400 years and then to 430 years. So the first section is 400 years. The second section is 430 years. But it could not be pointing to the history. Because if you will go to the history, brothers and sisters, the first section is 30 years and the second section is 400. Now, let us continue reading. It says, Ezekiel's prophecy is made exactly the same way in two sections, but not the same number of years in each section. Instead of 400 years, we have 390. And instead of 30 years, we have 30, making the same total of 430 years in each case. If this prophecy had a reference to the prophecy made to Abraham, there should have been the same number of years in each section. But since it is not the same, it must be another period of time. Now, I would like to explain that statement, but at this time, I could no longer be able to completely finish to explain this portion. Remember the statement, it says, very plain, brothers and sisters. Let us read again, saying, if this prophecy had a reference to the prophecy made to Abraham, there should have been the same number of years in each section. There is a puzzle in that statement, because even in the 430 years historically, it's not the same number of years. Because the first section, let us go first to history. History. 430 years by Abraham. So, the 430 years by Abraham. The first section, this is the first section, 30 years. The second section, 400 years. That is the first section and the second section. But the only section in the 430 years by Abraham in history by which it is the same period of time, it must be from the call of Abraham to the time when Jacob entered into Egypt. That is exactly the same period of time. 215 years, 215 years. The dividing line. The entrance of Jacob into Egypt. The same period of time. 215 and 215. But this cannot be found in Genesis 15:13 to 15. Because in Genesis 15:13 to 15, that is 30 years and 400 years. As stated here in 1SR 114, which typifying Ezekiel 4, in Ezekiel Chapter 4, the first section is 390 years and the second section is 40 years. The same total, 430 years. So the division is not the same period of time, 390 and 40. Or in other words, the 430 years in Ezekiel, there is no section by which its sections are the same period of time. Only the 430 years that was made by God to Abraham. Historically, this is the only section by which the first section is the same with the second section. Equal, totally equal, 215 years, 215 years. And in this portion, by which the statement that is connected with Israel, the truth, the 144,000 living saints. Why, brothers and sisters? Now, let me read to you. First, concerning that 430 years which is equal, which is connected with Israel, the true, the 144,000, according to a reading in 1SR page 116. Now, let us read 1SR on page 76. The land of Goshen. The beginning of this denomination was typified by Israel's entrance into Egypt as previously explained. So, do not forget that statement. It says, the beginning of this denomination was typified by Israel's entrance into Egypt as previously explained. It is pointing to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We shall now consider the truth of the land of Goshen. Joseph brought Israel into Egypt and gave them the part of the land to dwell in, which was the best land in the country of Egypt. And there Joseph nourished them, their flocks, herds, and cattle, and all they had. See Genesis 45, verse 10. The land of Goshen stands as a symbol of the United States of America, in which the church came into existence. While our country is productive, like the land of Goshen, the richest in the world, and a Protestant nation, it is the best for missionary work, for it is made up of all nations, and therefore, like the land of Goshen, the most productive in Egypt, the world. Now, the Shepherd's Rod made it so plain that the beginning of the denomination, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, brothers and sisters, is typifying according to the voice of inspiration, Israel entry into Egypt, or Jacob entrance into Egypt. And what year is that? When Jacob entered into Egypt? The second year of famine. That was the second year of famine. Let us read. So here, brothers and sisters, such subject must be connected with the 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And the only way that you could comprehend it clearly is to have a complete and clear understanding concerning the Bible creation calendar. Now let us read 1 SR page 73. 70 souls type of organization. It says, Israel arrived in Egypt in the second year of famine. Genesis 45 verse 10 and 11. So what year of famine by which Israel arrived in Egypt? That is the second year of famine. But that is the literal. How about the antitype? What is represented by the year of famine? It is represented by, I would like to read 1 SR. Page 19. 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. The 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine in the days of Joseph in ancient Egypt represents the world history in two sections of time as previously explained, namely BC and AD. Each one of these sections bears the biblical number 7, meaning complete. The 7 years of plenty is BC. Though one may doubt the application made here, the lesson we receive from it is true. So what is the 7 years of plenty? That is represented by the entire years of BC. In page 17, it says, the symbol can represent only one thing, and that is the world's history in two great divisions of time, namely BC and AD, with the cross of Christ the dividing line. What is the dividing line, brothers and sisters, in the 430 years, which is equal to 15 and to 15? Jacob entry into Egypt. What is the antitype? The beginning of the denomination of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. When does the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that denomination begins? Now, I would like to read first this reading in 1 SR, page 75. It says, the lesson intended is that in the beginning of the church in 1845, so it could not be 1844, because in October 22, 1844, that is the disappointment. According to 2 SR page 97, in the disappointment, the movement created by Miller ended. So according to the reading in 1 SR page 75, the beginning of the denomination of the Seventh-day Adventist Church began in the year 1845. And we're talking about the Gregorian calendar. Brethren, it is a long study, but it is closely connected to the first Day of Atonement. The first Day of Atonement is not in 1844. But rather in 1845. Gregorian calendar. The first Day of Atonement, it is October 10, 1844. Bible calendar, not Gregorian. So we are now studying, brothers and sisters, the first Day of Atonement to the last Day of Atonement in connection with the 430 years. And this is the last verse that I would like to share, and we will continue on our next episode. Here in Ezekiel Chapter 5, let's read Ezekiel Chapter 5 on verse 1. And thou, son of man, take thee a sharp knife, take thee a barber's razor, and cause it to pass upon thine head, and upon thy bird. Then take thee balances to weigh and divide the hair. It says, thou shalt burn with fire a third part in the midst of the city, when the days of the seeds are fulfilled. And thou shalt take a third part and smite about it with a knife, and a third part thou shalt scatter in the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. But I would like to focus to the portion, it says, after, when the days of the seeds are fulfilled. How many days the seeds mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 5? It is found in Ezekiel chapter 4. That is 430 years. That is 430 years. Now let us read, brothers and sisters, in Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 7. Therefore thou shalt set thy face toward the seeds of Jerusalem, and thine arm shall be uncovered, and thou shalt prophesy against it. And behold, I will lay bands upon thee, and thou shalt not turn thee from one side to another till thou hast ended the days of thy sins. So the statement in Ezekiel chapter 5 verse 2 is pointing to the perfect fulfillment, brothers and sisters, by which the 430 years in its perfect fulfillment, which is still future in the days of Atonement, will be fulfilled, by which this reading is pointing to the purification. The last day of atonement, the blotting out of names. And we will explain it later in our next episode. And to repeat again, brothers and sisters, hoping that the good Lord will bless you, would help you, brothers and sisters. Brethren, with honesty and with sincerity, I am pleading with all my fellow Shepherd's Rod believer, with all my brethren, that this message is very important. Brethren, I know that the devil is trying his best to bother you so that you could not focus your attention to listen to this message. And I would like to read, brothers and sisters, this reading in the old symbolic code, two symbolic codes, 7 and 8, pages 6 and 7. Not without a struggle does Satan allow the kingdom of God to be built up in the earth. The forces of evil are engaged in unceasing warfare against the agency appointed for the spread of the gospel, and these powers of darkness are especially active when the truth is proclaimed before men. It says, of repute and sterling integrity. Acts of the Apostles, page 167. In the upper portion, in two symbolic code, 7 and 8, page 6, I would like to read this statement. It says, let every minister in the place of standing to criticize, the question, to doubt, and oppose, if there is the semblance of a chance to do so, be now employed in erecting barriers against the wily fools. Rather than fight against those whom the Lord has sent to save this, let His people pray fervently and continually for the power of God's grace, and that the captain of the Lord's host will take the field. Rather than sit in judgment upon men whom God has accepted to do Him service, let the burden of their prayer be night and day, that the Lord may send forth more laborers into His vineyard. Ministers, do not dishonor your God and grieve His Holy Spirit by casting reflections on the ways and manners of the men He would choose. God knows the character. He sees the temperament of the men He has chosen. He knows that none but earnest, firm, determined, strong-feeling men will view this work in its vital importance and will put such firmness and decision into their testimonies that they will make a break against the barriers of Satan. Two symbolic codes 7 and 8, page 6 and 7. Or in other words, those reading, brothers and sisters, in reality, I would like to make it clear that do not waste your time investigating the life of the messenger. And I would like to tell it frankly that, brothers and sisters, it is the prerogative of God, whomever He will choose. Now, if it so happen that the messenger that God chooses is a wicked man, brothers and sisters, it doesn't mean that when God chooses such messenger, is already an assurance and a guarantee that he will be saved. The best example is Balaam. Balaam is a wicked prophet, but God chose him, according to tract number 6, page 47 and 48, to proclaim the most sublime truth concerning Jesus Christ. Ethiopian says, would you repudiate that sublime truth because the wicked prophet is the one who proclaimed the message? Now, brothers and sisters, if it is really true, if it is the reality that those opponents, those who are opposing this message, are saying that the messenger is a wicked man, then, brothers and sisters, if that is the reality, for sure that messenger will not obtain salvation. He is unworthy of salvation. Even though God used him to proclaim the message, he cannot be saved because he is a wicked man. Such prerogative belongs to God, brethren. The only things that you need to study is the message. Try to study the Bible, writings of Sister White and B.T. Hotep. If this message is founded, barricaded by a thus saith the Lord, the word it is written. Brothers and sisters, yes, I know that I am not worthy. I know that I am not righteous man, my dear brothers and sisters. And to all the brethren who are always busy engaging character assassination and spreading prejudices everywhere, brothers and sisters, the only thing that I could say is that I am thanking, I thank the Lord and also to the brethren who are accusing me, because for such accusation, it totally humbled myself and I could draw closer to God to ask forgiveness, brothers and sisters. And I know that there are many people who hated me. But this is one thing that I would like to testify and to tell you, brethren. Only God knows, brothers and sisters. Every day I am praying to all my brethren, even those who are speaking evil against me. I love you, brethren, and hoping to see you in God's kingdom. May the good Lord bless you and have a wonderful evening.